Today's episode of the Ramp It Up podcast contains explicit language and may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener's discretion is advised. Ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to the Ramp It Up podcast with your host, Ronell Sinuis.
Are you ready to ramp it up?
Ramp it up, ew!
Hey, yo, ramp it up, B.
Girl, ramp it up! Ramp it up!
The Ramp It Up podcast.
Hey, you need to ramp it up.
Ramp it up.
And we are back with another episode of the Ramp It Up podcast. I am your host and your favorite Zo on Wheels, Ronell. We are in the month of June. Summer is here. Kids are out of school, eating up all the food out your fridge, raising the electric bill, tracking their dirty feet in the house, the whole 9 yards. But I know you're happy. I know you're excited to have the kids back home. I don't have kids, so not my problem. But the summer is here, but for those of us who live in South Florida and on the east coast of the United States, it also means hurricane season. Hurricane season is from June the 1st to November 30th. And although many of us here in South Florida, we like to throw parties or ignore the warnings when hurricanes coming until like the very last minute, it is still serious. And if you're like me and many of my listeners, you're a wheelchair user, a lot of these warnings are a bit scary. In fact, they're a lot scarier than they used to be because of preparation. We can't prepare the same way some of us used to prepare, or it was never a source of concern for some of us who may have acquired our spinal cord injuries or disorders later on in life. So on today's episode, we're going to be talking about not only hurricane preparedness, but we're going to slip in a little bit more of just overall emergency preparedness. What do you do before an emergency, during, and after? How do you not only stay safe, you make sure your property is safe, what connections you should be making, and of course, what can your community do for you? When I say your community, not just your neighbors, but the government. No, not just the government, but your social services and the programs that are in your area. How can they assist you as a person with a disability, as a wheelchair user, to make sure you are safe during these storms? I have lived in South Florida since 1992. About 31 years. I have lost track of how many times the news has claimed that this is the big one. It's going to be taking us out. But nonetheless, we need to take all of the warnings seriously. It's actually been extremely rainy the last 2 weeks. We've had thunderstorms and nonstop rain, and this is just the beginning. We're hoping that nothing big comes this year, but like I said, it's all about being prepared. Now, don't take my word for it. I have Dr. David W. McMillan joining us. Actually, again, he joined us on the podcast on our first season. We were preparing for the holidays, and I know Dr. David from the Miami Project to Cure Paralysis and the University of Miami, where he works as a researcher. And then we were talking about calories and food and intake, his specialty having been exercise science at the time, with an emphasis on how it affects those of us with spinal cord injuries and how our bodies respond to burning calories post-spinal cord injury. But now David is also working on climate change and how it affects those with disabilities, specifically wheelchair users, and preparing for hurricanes and natural disasters. So we get to sit down with Dr. David, and he shares about some of the research that he and his fellows are doing at the Miami Project to Cure Paralysis, and the information and packets that they put together to assist us as wheelchair users to be prepared not just this season, but in general, how to get our family members and friends involved in our preparedness as well. So stay tuned for a great conversation with Dr. David W. McMillan. And on today's episode, I have a good friend of mine, a guest who I've had the pleasure of having on the podcast previously in our first season, joining me again. Everyone say hello to Dr. David W. McMillan. Although he earned his doctor, he doesn't like us calling us doctor, but I'm going to say it anyway. Dr. McMillan,
It's
hello.
great to be here with you, Ronell. Last time we talked about Thanksgiving, and I would like to say that in the context of what we'll talk about today, in some way, we're all the turkey right before Thanksgiving.
The doom is coming, we know.
We're all the turkey the day before Thanksgiving is so convinced that friends are its best, people are its best friend. And in the same way, Miami calls to a certain type of person and says, come to me. I'm flat. I'm warm. I have no state income tax. I have great hospitals. Come to me. But we're all just getting set up in one way, you know? People should come here. But then this thing happens, right? So in the context of this conversation, that's great. We go from Thanksgiving to the turkey before Thanksgiving.
Exactly. Those 6 months of the year when we're beautiful, but not so beautiful.
Too beautiful.
But, you know, before we jump in, I know I've known you for about what? I'll say since the first Miami project building, solid 4 or 5 years now. And I'm about to ask you the most important question I think I've asked you thus far. Before we even get into the topic, what does the W in your name stand for? I have no idea.
I was going to say the answer is 42, but actually this one is but before you even ask, it's 42 at least. There's a lot of Davids. It's a common name. It's from a big book that's real old, at least real old, like by writing standards. And McMillan's a very common last name. We have a clan that's still active in Scotland. We have a clan president. We have a castle. It's pretty cool.
Oh, that's dope.
So between those two things, if I publish anything, I like to go with the writing name David W. McMillan, because I'm very hidden on the internet, which is very good in a certain sense, but it's not good if you're trying to be found as an author. So W is William. It's from my father. It's my father's name.
Well, lucky you for being hidden on the internet. When your name is Ronell Sinus,
I'm gonna find you. Yep.
No escaping. Yeah, very easy.
I'm gonna find you on accident.
As David said, last time he was on here, we talked about Thanksgiving and preparing our plates, post-spinal cord injury, weight loss, and heart disease are big areas of concern for many wheelchair users. So we talked a little bit about what our plates look like and, health, and with David's experience and his background in both your bachelor's and the master's in exercise science. And now this stemmed from in 2010, David was involved in a community research project involving exercise and people with spinal cord injuries. The experience set Dr. McMillan on a trajectory, and he is now a clinical researcher using metabolic science to learn about SCI and identify low-tech, low-cost strategies for targeting obesity in people with spinal cord injuries. His dissertation pertains to the role of the autonomic nervous system in the absorption, trafficking, and fates of dietary fat. Now he's refocusing his efforts to align with regional demands and affordances, aiming at the disproportionate risks and rewards posed by the tropical Atlantic on patients with spinal cord injuries. Regarding the risks, he studies the vulnerabilities of patients with spinal cord injuries to climate hazards in the form of flooding, heat, and hurricanes. Regarding rewards, he studies the transformative potential that adaptive ocean activities, such as sailing, scuba diving, swimming, and others, carries for adults with physical abilities. So we're going to talk a bit about ULINK and STiCHH and a few other things. We'll share the acronyms afterwards. But in layman's terms, everything that I just read, tell us how you went from exercise science, helping us out in the gym and what we should eat and calorie intake and all that fun stuff, to now talking about climate change, the weather, and for those of us on the east side or the east coast of the U.S.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Imagine yourself in your 80s, 90s, and 100s. What does life look like? Are you living life on your own terms? I'm Zanat Reza, host of the Future Age podcast. Join us as we disrupt the status quo and explore creative solutions to reimagine what life could look like now and in the future. Be part of the journey and follow the Future Age wherever you get your podcasts.
Hurricane season.
Yeah, it seems like a big jump, huh? And in some sense it is, but I'm listening to what people with spinal cord injuries tell me is important in their lives. And one of the most engaging topics is food. It's underengaged and everyone's interested in it. Just a quick plug, we're about to start the Neuronutrition Clinic, which is a once monthly free registered dietitian course tuned to people with spinal cord injuries. So come here to the Lynn Rehab Center through the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine to receive those services through a grant that Dr. Alicia Snedge wrote. But you could think like food, hurricanes, what's the dig here? I was born in a desert and I grew up on an island. And so I've always had an affinity for the ocean. I went from the most resource scarce water situation to the most water abundant situation very abruptly before I was even forming the type of memories that we think of as like, in a linguistic sense. And so it was always natural to me to be connected to the ocean and to water. I came here and I became science famous for things involving postprandial metabolism and dietary fat absorption. These are like fun, big words that we've shared about these things before. And I'm the first person to put U13C palmitate into someone with a spinal cord injury. It's a stable isotope lipid tracer, et cetera, et cetera. In the end, it's all systems and energy. And the disproportionate impact that certain weather events have on people with spinal cord injuries is nested in a whole ecology of physical abilities, social norms, and access and things like this, right? But also the fact that climate change is making certain weather events more likely and other ones less likely. And some of those we call disasters and emergencies and some we don't. That's all the same thing. There's physical components, there's social components, and foods like that, like dietary lipid absorption is this thing that occurs because of multiple organ systems talking to each other in your body. But the reason you put food in your mouth, there's probably a social component to it, right? Like maybe someone before your injury told you they loved you and they did things with you and they can't do some of those things with you now, so they can show you they love you by feeding you, right? It's super common. And so for all of this, there's like through lines for me, at least. And one of the things I love about science is that the scientific method is a way to generate self-correcting plausibility across any of those domains. And so I can still take my expertise in doing science and apply it to whatever new problem people with spinal cord injuries tell me to. But how did I come across the problem of hurricanes? Well, I first experienced a hurricane myself in Hawaii when I was growing up, before I had any agency to do anything about it. And so I just remember my mom holding me and the walls shaking, right? And then grew up Southern California, Arizona, Colorado, and then came to Florida as an adult and experienced a hurricane. And just to be frank, shit my pants and went to Tennessee. I was not okay with that happening.
I've had conversations with friends of mine who've never experienced a hurricane, and they kind of minimize. They're like, it's probably just a thunderstorm. I'm like, no, like hurricane. Like, how do you explain to someone who's never been in a hurricane what a hurricane is? Just
looking at the satellite imagery, I was like, goodbye. I'll see you guys in a week. Yeah. That was. I'm trying to remember actually which hurricane that was. It might have been Irma. It could have been Michael.
What year?
It was. I don't do well with storing years in terms of episodic life events. I think it was 17. I know who I was dating at the time, so I could go back, like I'm sure in my Facebook memories and find I think it was Irma though, because Irma was
wide.
Actually,
yes. I had said Maria. No, you're right. 2017 was Irma.
Yeah, but Michael was after that, and I remember Michael too. So, yeah, definitely. Okay, so there's all that, but then more importantly, Dr. David Gator started working for the University of Miami at a very pivotal time in my transition, my career. And he went to a spinal cord injury support group meeting put on here by the Dade and Broward chapters. And the point of the spinal cord injury support group meeting wasn't hurricanes, but it was in May, I think, or maybe June, beginning of hurricane season. And after the meeting, he just detected this kind of feeling of anxiety. He was just asking people in a very informal sense, like, hey, you getting ready for hurricane season, this and that. And he detected anxiety. And so, as a very sensitive person as he was like, well, and someone who understands that they have access to resources, right? Like through academia, he was like, well, let's do something about this. So he got these two awesome medical students together. And he said, look, go to the county, download their hurricane preparedness packet, and then tune it to spinal cord injury. So every one of the steps, follow those steps, but take it and tune it to spinal cord injury. And most of the steps, like the broad framework, is still similar, except actually we add one more step that doesn't exist for people without mobility impairments. But most of the steps are pretty much the same. You just have to add or subtract things, right? They're the same in terms of theoretically how you would think about how to go about this. The research we've done since then shows that the way that those steps are actually navigated in real life is way different than people without spinal cord injuries. But in general, just to run through them real quick, you're going to register yourself with whatever services that you want to receive locally. That's the same for me, someone without a spinal cord injury, but where you register yourself is different if you have a physical disability, right? You're then going to make a decision on whether or not you're going to shelter in place or evacuate. Right, that depends on where you live, which flood zone you're in, what the structure is like that you live in, et cetera, et cetera. After that, you're going to prepare. You're going to get your packet together. When it comes to consumable and durable medical supplies, if you have a spinal cord injury, those things are much different than other situations. You're going to identify your support network. That's a social support network, but that's also like a professional one in the sense that, like, who's my doctor? Can I get my doctor ready? Can they get me more supplies? It kind of feeds back into that other one. But also, where am I going to go if I get hurt during the hurricane? What is that? That's all the support network. And then the fifth one is the main one that we add that the county doesn't have, which is you have to practice this, because let's say you have a cervical spinal cord injury and your tetraplegia results in you being a power wheelchair user, but you think the power might be out and you've got this backup manual chair. When's the last time you practiced pushing that backup manual chair?
Or can you push the backup manual chair?
Or do you have a caregiver who is supposed to be able to help you with that, but they haven't pushed that manual chair, right? Practice these skills. When's the last time you transferred onto a novel surface? When's the last time you tried to prep a bed or a surface to sleep on to not get a skin wound, but that wasn't the bed that you sleep in every day? Practice these skills, right? So that's the last one we add. That's to run through all of them. And then there's these county-specific resources, and there's all these links and all this stuff. And we can get into that, but that's all shared through part of my grant, which you previously referred to as STiCHH, which is a science communication outlet with reputable information from University of Miami experts that's called the Subtropical Climate and Health Hub. So it's a hub for these resources. The beachhead is spinal cord injury. It was founded for spinal cord injury and always will involve that, but it's also going to branch out beyond other disability types because in general, a lot of the stuff applies to mobility impairment due to physical disability in general. So
before we get into it, I really want to go back to the steps for preparation that you mentioned, because long-time Miami resident, since ironically we're talking about hurricanes. 92, we moved from Rhode Island, Johnston, Rhode Island, where I lived for a number of years, to Miami, Florida in right at the beginning of August of 1992, literally weeks before Hurricane Andrew kicked us in the head, not in the butt or anything, it kicked us in the head.
Yeah, I heard.
There are places in South Florida that are still 31 years later, are trying to rebuild, or you'll see the scars on the earth from Hurricane Andrew. So keep that in mind. So us northern folk knew nothing about what Hurricane Andrew is like. So having lived down here since then, preparation for hurricanes was essentially about 3 or 4 things. It was stockpiling snacks and water. That's one thing any Miami person will tell you. You got to stockpile your snacks and your water. 2, clean out your yard. If you're not in an apartment and you're in a house, you want to make sure there's no big rocks or, yard equipment or anything that could just lift up in the wind, flying into windows. Back then, we didn't really have the hurricane shutters or windows or doors. So we boarded up the house. So that was number 3. And the 4th thing was we checked on we always checked on our aunt or our elderly neighbors or relatives. So those were our 4 steps. And growing up, it was my father, my brothers, and I. We did these things. And I don't want to say we took it for granted, but it never crossed your mind. You're just doing these physically able things that you could do going about the city. As I said, I'm now 30, spinal cord injury in 2016, 2017 is rolling around. and they're talking about hurricanes. And I think I can't even say hurricane was the last thing on my mind when I got hurt. It just wasn't there. You were thinking about everything else in life, forgetting that you live in South Florida and hurricane season is inevitable. And that year, Irma came around, and first of all, Irma was crazy. It was people were evacuating. I had to rent a vehicle in case we needed to evacuate. We were worried about power. So those 4 steps that I was used to doing all my life, they were not an option. You know, I couldn't go out and make sure I had enough water. Like you said, I wasn't concerned or prepared about with my DMEs, make sure I had chucks and catheters and all these other things in hand. So one thing I really want to stress to my listeners are, especially if you're getting your injury later on in life, or if you're developing a disorder that's making you become a wheelchair user, you have to, as David said, look at those same steps and switch up the game, because it's not going to be the same. You're not going to be able to rush to 5 or 6 different Walmarts looking for water the same way everyone else is doing. If you've lived in South Florida for any amount of time, you know what that hustle is that day before hurricane, when all the shelves are empty. And ironically, we tend to party when it's hurricane season down here. So, you know, for those who like to get their bottles or other party supplies, you know, those are the crazy things. But those aren't really in the cards for me anymore while I'm in my power chair. So those are things I really want to stress. The differences in between the steps from before, when you were able to physically do them by yourself, to now that you're probably relying on friends, caregivers, or family.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things from the outside, I don't have a spinal cord injury, looking in, that it seems like changes the most outside of the realm of physical abilities is spontaneity. You have to, it seems like you have to plan everything. And that's like, that applies to this. Actually, with the support groups now, one of the support group local presidents is written into the grant, and they've been a lived experience consultant the whole time throughout this process. And we engaged our county partners, and we asked them to come and do hurricane preparedness workshops, which they're totally tooled to do, but specific to spinal cord injury. And the county was, their eyes widened when we asked them to come so early. And I don't think they understood how much the preparedness is going to the time elapse. Where if you're born and raised in Miami and you're accustomed to, like, 2 days before, spontaneously, you just jam down to Home Depot and, I don't know, like, shoulder people off for the plywood.
You got to,
you know. But no, you got to be prepared in advance for this. You got to be thinking about it. And really, when it comes to this, so the 4 things you listed are basically in step 3 and 4 of what I listed, which was prepare and support. Right. And so when it comes to the support group, you're going to have a much different relationship with the network, because as opposed to that being like a cherry on top, like for me, if I could do it with that, I don't have family here, I could do it. For some people, it's a necessity. Right. And it's not a want, it's a need when it comes to the support. So you're going to have a different relationship there. And then for prepare, there's just going to be more logistics involved. So all that's going to take more time. But I think important with what you were running through before, you know, even before your spinal cord injury, steps 1 and 2 apply to everyone, and those weren't there, right? I think that's important. There are county services that I can register for. I didn't know this before I started doing this research, that I ought to, and it's very simple sign up stuff, you know, so everyone understands the structure, kind of the actual response level, things that are happening, scale from the city, county, state, and then afterwards up federal. But it's almost all city and county for response. For recovery, that's when it's going to start to invert, and you're going to get more federal resources that come in. But essentially, FEMA's not involved until something went wrong, and then you're rebuilding, right? So that's just kind of the structure. For preparedness, it is supposed to be kind of like the response phase, where things are supposed to go from municipal up to county and then to state. So keep that in mind, right? When you're registering, certain things are going to look like FEMA level stuff, but that doesn't kick in unless it got super bad. The stuff you're actually going to probably interact with is more like city level stuff. So you need to register at multiple levels. We have a county special needs registry that gets you access to special needs shelters and medical management facilities if you have extra special medical needs. These are all the terms that the county uses. So I just use their language when it comes to special needs. So that's with registering, and then making your decision. Actually, in terms of our research, This is the number one area where there's a disconnect between people in South Florida with and without spinal cord injuries. So here's the decision tree. Are you going to shelter in place, or are you going to evacuate if the big one hits? So hypothetical is, it looks like it's coming and the track is pretty confident and it hasn't been bouncing around. And okay, so am I going to shelter in place or evacuate? And this is what we saw from the original survey study that we did, initiated in 2019. We have all the data now. It's been submitted for publication in a journal, peer-reviewed journal. And it showed that of the 80 or so people that we had give a full response to the survey, granted, they all live in South Florida, they all have spinal cord injuries. That's a great response rate. Of them, one person across the entire history of their time in South Florida had ever gone to a special needs shelter in response to a hurricane. And their story was a horror story. And probably what happens, this is not confirmed, but this is our hypothesis, is that vicarious trauma is committed through or translated through the grapevine. Everyone in the community hears about it because it's a tight-knit community, and they're like, well, I ain't going there. Okay, so in step 2, your decision tree is shelter in place or evacuate. You're sheltering in place. Well, where do you live? You're not going to go through the nuance of that. Me, I look up my flood zone. My house it's concrete block. It was built in 1924, right? I'm probably good to shelter in place. I'm in a low flood zone risk. It's like zone E, right? But you don't even think about that stuff, right? I'm not going to a shelter, therefore I'm sheltering in place. And so if I'm not going to evacuate, I'm staying in this building. Your decision has been made for you in that sense. And so if your building is or isn't good enough, you're now in a situation of learned helplessness where I don't have decisions available to me. My cards have been played because I'm not going to that shelter because I heard that guy and about the pressure wounds he got and et cetera, right? So then I don't have options. And step 2, it's cut off. That's one of the main take-homes that we found from that first round of survey studies that we did. It was actually the lack of utilization of the resources that amazed us. People were generally pretty knowledgeable about the resources, especially city and county level resources, which is exactly how they're designed. So people's knowledge of resources we thought was very appropriate, and that they were doing their diligence to, educate themselves, et cetera, but they weren't engaging with them. So what does it tell you if someone knows that something exists, but they don't choose to then utilize it? Right. So there's a disconnect there. And that's one of the main things we found also through that survey study. We found that people were more or less confident with their abilities to actually execute on the knowledge that they had. So if they knew about it and they thought that they could do it, why aren't they doing it? That's got to be a disconnect in the actual service provision itself, or at least a perception of that. So whether or not this is rumors or true, right, all that matters is people aren't engaging with the services. And so their whole decision-making tree has been cut off at the start, right? So.
And I'm glad you brought up the evacuation because, first of all, the majority of South Floridians, we do not evacuate. It has to be like Hurricane Andrew levels for us to consider evacuating.
Irma's proof of that. Ian,
the people
my bad. Ian's proof of that, right?
Yeah. Even people in the Keys or who live by the beach are usually forced out. And if you know anything about the Keys, they're one major storm away from just being the key, like just one little island left.
I should not be laughing at that, but that was well said.
I know it's pretty bad.
That was well said.
Yeah. So
key.
The reality is we don't. We're so used to it, and I think the problem is we've been lulled into a false sense of security because the hurricanes come every 5 to 6, 7 years. So, and then the media tends to over embellish how bad it is. They're like, it's Hurricane Armageddon. This is the big one. Mm-hmm. You go out, spend hundreds of dollars on supplies. You evacuate, and then the day of, it's just some rain. And then you get this false sense of security. And then the following year, when you do nothing, that's when the big one hits. So, we have this love-hate relationship with the news because we have to keep our ears to it during the season, but then we don't really trust them. So when it comes down to evacuation, you're either being forced out, you're getting notices, or the emergency services are telling you you have to leave the area. And as Dr. McMillan said, most of us don't know. I knew nothing about shelters. In fact, my understanding of the shelters were they were in place if your home was damaged post hurricane, you needed somewhere to go. I did not know they were set up. So even less special needs shelters. The last few hurricanes, or I'll say the first couple post injury, my family was just like, well, you're going to the hospital because what if in our area, we don't flood, but we lose power if the wind blows too hard. So we've had hurricanes where we didn't have power for 2 weeks or so. After Irma in 2017, we didn't have power for a little over a week. And again, I had really bad wounds that year. I'm in power bed, so I ended up having to go to a friend's house to stay for the week. Thankfully, they had power. Again, evacuating. I didn't have a plan. We didn't know what to do. So the reality is looking into those services. Now, I know calling 311, it's not always easy because, to be honest, the operators and those on phone don't always have all the information for you. So with some of the information that you have, where can they go to find out where the appropriate place is for them to go ahead and evacuate? And how do you let your needs be known prior in that preparation stage?
Yes. This is a perfect opportunity to go through this. So what you described before is probably the norm thought process with this, which is now I have a difference in the response to a hurricane, right? Okay, I'm going to go to a hospital because I have a special medical need that's like, I mean, if you're a power wheelchair user, right, you're at a certain level. And what really the registry is for, and these special needs shelters are for, is to not overwhelm hospitals so that in the preparation phase, so that they can respond in the response and the recovery phase, right? So the hospitals are meant to be treating people with acute trauma and not chronic health conditions in the context of a hurricane. And so when you register, you can list your special medical needs. There are resources for you in the preparation phase, and the shelters are part of that. So that's a super important thing to identify, Ronell. Thank you for that. Right?
Yes, sir.
So you can get these resources, right, through the form of your consumable and durable medical supplies. And unfortunately, the burden for that is going to kind of fall on you, but you do have people who can help you with that. So that's both your primary care physician. Hopefully you have one of those. If not, come talk to us. We have multiple spinal cord injury medicine board certified physicians here at the Lynn Rehabilitation Center, et cetera, et cetera. It can also be through whoever your suppliers are. So it might be through either like a medical supply equipment or your physician, right? So I know that there's some local medical supply companies, and they definitely understand living with spinal cord injuries. Some of them are run by people with spinal cord injuries, and they can definitely help you stock up in advance. They know what those needs are like. Okay, great. So some of that is through the shelters, some of it's through you. And when it comes to registering, like, for example, the closer you get here down in Florida to your house, the more specific the registration services can be. So at the FEMA level, they just have this giant disaster assistance thing that you can register for, and you should. Are you ever going to use it? Hopefully not. But as you get down closer and closer, there's a FPL, Florida Power and Light, Medical Essential Services, MES, form that you can fill out. And if you show that you have a special medical need that results in you requiring power, right, for your health, so usually it's you're on a respirator, or you can make the argument that if you are without power, you will develop pressure wounds. You should make that argument. If you want help making that argument, come to us. We can help you frame that language, provide you with the evidence. And you can register for the FPL MES. And you might get what it does is it gets priority reestablishment of power when the power goes out. And so they're always sending out multiple workers to reestablish power, and they'll prioritize it to your grid if you have this FPL MES.
I want to accentuate something that you just said. They will try. I've made the phone call. Yep. I've spoken to them. Dr. McMillan is not telling you that they're going to turn your power on first. They're going to do their best. They're going to prioritize. That was my understanding that, here's your house. They'll flip the switch back on. No, they'll do their best to understand your neighborhood, who's there, and what the needs are. And they will do their best to try and reach you. But depending on the damage or if there's flooding, it will be a little bit more difficult. But do your best to at least get on the registry and let them know. Yep. That way they'll keep you in mind.
Yeah, they can give no guarantees. And in the end, if the grid that you're on has a certain, underdeveloped kind of grid situation that makes it hard to reestablish power, that's the situation for the grid, right? The employees are going to show up and try and hook things back up. But there's some tricks, right? So one of the tricks is if you're on a grid that is close to a hospital or another major municipal service, that those grids are built with more resilience. They should all be built that way. It's not the case we're living with that. And a lot of people don't have the options to relocate. But if you're coming here for the first time, et cetera, you're going to relocate for some other reason. Those are some tricks, right? So you can look up these grid patterns on, .govs and whatnot. And those that are connected to hospitals, other major municipal areas, and especially those connected to schools that will be designated as shelters, those are always going to have power reestablished first. So take a look at those. Yep.
One thing I really want to stress, and this goes back to the preparation stages, the DMEs. We mentioned it a couple of times, your durable medical equipment. Something else I ran into in my first year, I'm just talking facts, people, my personal experience. Your supplies are extremely important when it comes to this time of year, because mainly a lot of mine coming through the mail. So no one's delivering during a hurricane. No one is open to go by CVS or go to Walmart or, pick up your medicines or your supplies, your chucks, anything of that nature. During the hurricane season, don't wait till it's being announced. Just try to double up on the amounts that you have. And even throughout the year, try to set a small amount aside for emergency period. You never know what can happen. We've talked about it previously, always having an emergency stock. And I'm not talking about one or two extra. We're talking about having at least a week's worth of extra supplies. So I used to do intermittent cathing, and that would be between 4 to 6 catheters a day. 4 to 6 a day. If you're talking about a week, you're talking about 28 to 42 catheters set aside just in case. And we all know sometimes they break, or the first time you try to use it doesn't work. So let's just say around 50 extra just sitting on the side. Now, I'm not saying let them sit there and get old. You do have to rotate them, make sure they're fresh, and nothing's drying out on the inside. Same thing with gloves, having an extra box of gloves or anything of your sanitary products. For those of us who do bowel program, the last thing you want is to have a bowel emergency during a hurricane. Odds are the ambulance is not going to come out and try to get you in the middle of the storm. So making sure you have your suppositories or whatever else you use on hand, extra amounts, 2 or 3 boxes. If you usually purchase 2 from the other 6 months of the year. Once it gets to about March, April, May, start buying an extra container just to make sure you have one. And if you don't end up using it, you just have a little extra for later on in the year anyway. So whatever supplies you may have, if it's medications, if your supplies are going to finish up right at the beginning or in the middle of your of the season, talk to your doctor about doubling up on your prescription. When I say double up, I'm not saying use twice as much. Okay, I'm not saying double up what you're taking, but having the supplies in the home at the moment so you're not waiting or trying to fight to get things of that nature. Another area of concern that I ran into that first year is those of us who have home health aides or caregivers that don't live in your home. They are people as well. They have families to take care of as well. And they may not be willing to come out during the storm, or sometimes the agencies tell them not to come out in the storm. I'm going to ask you first, David, and I'll share my experience. What do we do in those cases?
Yeah, you make sure, step 4, you have that support group there through many different diversity of inputs. I'm here as a transplant. I don't have family here. I've been here long enough that I have a great support network through my friendships, but let's say you came here, you didn't have friends, you hadn't established that yet. You would want to then consider that in the beginning of your decision making, the tree here, right? You'd register yourself, and then you would think about evacuating to a shelter where, even though the situation probably is maybe less dignified in some sense, at least you know that there's someone right there who can at least respond to your verbal call, right? So, yep, that's really important. With the caregivers, keep in mind that, 1, they can choose not to show up because they have a family and whatnot to care for. 2, their company could tell them not to show up, so even if they wanted to, they won't. Or 3, they could be barred from arriving just due to restrictions that occur in the post-storm phase that make it so that certain people can't cross into certain areas for reasons such as looting, et cetera, et cetera. And this is especially common out on Miami Beach, where you cross over the causeways. They lock those causeways down so that the beach doesn't get looted, et cetera, et cetera. And if you have a caregiver who's out here and you're on the beach or vice versa, they're not going to be able to cross those lines unless they have a special written note all of these things. So keep this in mind when it comes to that support network, right? If you have the means and you know that in that support network you have less options, you might use those means to consider evacuating further, like all the way to a point where you're more confident that a hurricane's not going to come. Keeping in mind that most of the time, if you relocate like all the way out of state or something like that, you have to have the fuel, you have to be able to get there. You probably need a caregiver to be coming with you to do that. Maybe not, but maybe. And then once you get there, you're going to be staying in hotels. So do the math on all this, right? This is like a lot of means that you would require to pull off all that. We're even starting with the assumption
money is what he meant.
Yeah. Or that you have a van, right? Like how'd you get a van, right? Like, so all of those things apply, a van or a vehicle, right? But so.
I was going to say my experience, one of the years, I think it was in 2018, we had a storm. It didn't reach hurricane level, but it was strong enough where there were concerns about coming to work. I don't want to say I was lucky, but my aide at the time, her husband was a truck driver. So she didn't want to stay home by herself anyway. So we're like, hey, come spend the night.
Sure.
So she spent like 2 days here. So I was fortunate enough for her to be able to, one, be safe for herself. Because again, you can't be just selfish and be like, hey, I need your assistance. No, you want them to be as safe as you are as well. And she was able to still provide me services. So I was fortunate. But there were other times where they were like, no, not only, again, because the agency said no, but the streets were flooded. They could not get to where I'm going. She used to take the bus at the time.
Sure.
And there was no way for her to get to my home. Thankfully, I had family members in the area. They're able to come through. So make sure you have that set up prior. That way, when someone makes the call and says, hey, I can't come, plan B kicks right in. Plan C, or if you have to displace, do what you need to do, just like Dr. David said. Another one that comes to mind is transportation. We mentioned buses, we mentioned vans or vehicles. Not all of us have our own vehicles. I do not. And during the storm, there's no calling STS or TOPS or the regular special transportation services. They're not on the regular schedules at all. Depending on your county, they'll let you know if they're suspending services, if they're changing their times, or if they're only coming out for evacuation purposes. Sometimes they'll come and do group evacuations. So what should we do to get ahead of our transportation situation?
One thing on your previous point, when it comes, that's our step 5, that's practice. And it's so important, practice with your care group, right? So I just want to reiterate that. That's the one step that doesn't apply to the rest of us, right? You should be practicing this with the support group that you're expecting to have to execute these plans. So when it comes to that, when's the last time your family member who's super willing to come over, they help someone transfer, right? Have they done that recently? Do they have good technique? If they throw their own back out in that transfer, that's going to be worse for everyone in that situation, right? So, okay, I just wanted to say that. Yeah, so special transportation services will actually be used to transport people to a special needs shelter, right? At a certain point, they shut down their normal operations and they're actually used to move people to the evacuation shelters, right? In that situation, there's actually 4 people who were in our study. 3, who said that they had used STS in that context. And one of them said it worked fantastically, that it went really well. And the other 2 said it didn't go so well. So that's, if our sample is representative, there you go, you have that. And so what you can do for transportation is identify that things are going to change in this situation. You can track public transportation on the Miami-Dade Transit website, and they keep all that up to date with alerts, et cetera, et cetera. But buses are going to stop because flooding, and because gusts. The train, the metro, even though it's raised, it's going to stop with gusting. If there's sustained gusting over, I think it's 30 knots, they shut the train line down. And then STS will transition into an emergency phase, moving only to and from shelters. And so they won't have transportation for, even if you're going to quote unquote shelter at your aunt's house, if you're not a special needs shelter location for the county, STS won't be taking you there after a certain point.
Oh, so it won't take you to,
it'll only move you to
a neighbor or someone or your another parent's house that they're taking you specifically to the shelters.
Just to the shelters that are county shelters, right? Unless it's X number of days in advance and they haven't met that hurricane mode that they go into. So if you're far enough in advance, but if you get to the point of needing evac because there has been an executed mandate from the county, it's most likely going to come. The county will give the command, but National Weather Service Miami, you'll probably see that issued from mandatory evac. If you're at that point, STS is only going to take you to a shelter that's registered for the county. So keep that in mind, right? If you want STS to transport you to a friend or family, you're going to have to do that more in advance. Yep. So all that applies. That's very true when it comes to transportation. One thing I want to say here that's super important is that with hurricanes, most deaths occur due to drowning, most deaths directly from the hurricane. So like many other situations, such as snow plowing, there's many deaths that occur that are indirect from the situation, that the heightened level of stress will induce a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, right? So that's the situation with hurricanes a lot. You see increased rates of MIs and strokes during hurricane times. But outside of that, direct deaths from hurricanes are almost always due to drowning. And it's very common for that drowning to occur in or close to a vehicle, because vehicles do not do well in water, and then you can get stuck in them. And that applies to people without mobility impairments, right? Then imagine trying to get out of a car if you had paralysis of your lower and or upper extremities. When that car, the pressure of the water is holding it in, can you break the window? I'm not sure, right? So I would be very, very diligent when it comes to moving around in vehicles if you have a spinal cord injury and there's a hurricane about. So make that decision early. And if you get past that point, stay where you are. Keep in mind, if you're in a high-risk flood zone, you can look these up, Know My Zone. If you Google Know My Zone Miami, you're going to find a great number of maps, right? And if you're in a high-risk flood zone, that water can rise, right, in the car or in the building. And if you're in a situation where you have a mobility impairment, it's less likely that you're going to be climbing stairs if you even have them. There's so many one-story, single-family homes in Dade County already, and Broward, Southeast Florida, I should be saying, right? So keep that in mind. Like if you're in either of those, don't be in a car, don't be in a building on the first floor in a high-risk flood zone. That requires a lot of diligent, planning. And so basically you're at step 2 super early, make that decision. If you know all these things are lining up, you just have to have a lower risk, a lower acceptance of risk when it comes to pulling the trigger and making that decision. And this was the case in Ian recently. And if you were paying attention to that storm, the track started further north and it came up over Cuba and accelerated like no one was predicting. So acceleration was predicting, but the rate of acceleration, that storm intensified as it came off that west coast of Cuba like that. And as it accelerated, it pulled further and further south instead of the projection of the track, right? And so as it pulled south, all of a sudden, Lee County was right in the impact zone. And Lee County issued mandates for evac. There's good empirical science to show that until you issue a mandate, people won't evac. Like you hinted at that before, Ronell. That's actually an evidence-based statement you were making. And so because those evac mandates, even though people knew the storm evac mandate came kind of late, just because the track of the storm and the way it intensified and had pulled down, people sheltered in place. And when people sheltered in place, there's multiple stories you can find of water levels rising in buildings and certain people not having the abilities required to respond to that in terms of going up or swimming, right? So keep that in mind. You got to make that decision way before the evac mandate. If you have a spinal cord injury, you have to be ready way before the evac mandate, because there isn't a communication about evacs that's tuned specifically to special medical needs. There are shelters, there are this and that, but you're going to get the same evac mandate that I get, right? And so you need to calibrate your risk profile to line up with that. You basically, if you have a spinal cord injury, don't wait till the mandate, right?
Now I'll say this, I don't know about my listeners, but I don't swim as good as I used to. I still float pretty well, but I'm not going to take that risk. And another thing I was just saying, like, always be ready. Always have a go bag. That's one thing I've done ever since I was younger, and I've shifted it a bit or to fit my current circumstances. Always have a go bag, an emergency bag. You don't want to be caught in the last minute, again, not being prepared, as we've been talking about, not having your supplies on hand. But it's one thing to have them on hand, but it's another thing if they're all spread out around the house, or we have like a shed where my extra Hoyer lift is. You don't have to go run to the shed in the middle of the rain to go get your Hoyer lift or your manual wheelchair or whatever it is. Have everything on hand, close by, that if it does happen and someone has just a few minutes to come run and help you, or transportation is coming, they don't wait that long. You don't get 30, 45 minutes. They don't come inside and help you. You get 5 minutes, you run, grab your stuff, and go in. So you want to have your meds, extra batteries, your charged items, whatever it is, right on hand, right by you. If you have a bag with extra clothes or your other DME supplies that fit in there, have them right on hand so you can snatch and go. I know we're coming up close on our time, but I have a lot of listeners who don't live on the East Coast, who don't deal with hurricanes. How much of the preparatory information that you have can be applied to other emergencies, fires, earthquakes, anything else?
Yep. Yeah. So in terms of the broad framework, it's going to be the same for all hurricanes. I'm sorry, all emergencies that are due to weather events. And then also non-weather events such as I grew up in California, and you're always thinking about the big one, right? An earthquake, and that's not weather, right? It's geological, but it's in that realm. So those 5 steps are gonna be the same across. But then there's human-caused disasters. And actually, recently I was talking to some colleagues in Sweden right after February 24th and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And it was amazing the overlap of what they were talking about in terms of preparedness for that. These are colleagues, they work with people that have spinal cord injuries, and what I knew about hurricane preparedness here. So in general, this broad framework applies to all those. But there's some very notable differences in the amount of preparedness that you can have with some of these. So an earthquake, you're going to have very, very little warning. And with a hurricane, you have a little bit more warning, and a tornado is kind of in between those things. And forest fires impact much broader swaths of land, but they move a lot slower, et cetera, compared to some of these things. So you want to tune it to your individual situation. There's been some stories recently about disability and responding to forest fires in California and whatnot. And you can look up those individual situations to see how you're going to tune it and respond. But yeah, the broad steps are still going to be there. The framework is still going to be there. And I think a lot of what we're learning from our research here in Southeast Florida, which is actually in the IPCC, which is the biggest climate change policy document adopted by, over 120 governments across the whole world, as well as the NCA, which is National Climate Assessment, which is a version of that tuned to the United States of America. In both of those, Miami is used as an example. And in the NCA, it's actually multiple chapters that Miami uses as an example. And so we are kind of ground zero, which is what we say, for the negative impacts of climate change on certain aspects of human living through extreme weather events. And what we're doing is we're writing the playbook, and that comes down to this as well. So my guess is that no matter what the disaster is that you're responding to, that second step of the decision-making process, that's the critical one for you. That's the one where you're going to feel most constrained. And it's also the one where you have to be most convicted in making an early decision. Because if you wait like me and you're lazy because you got an able body, it's not going to go the same as it did before, right? You have to be thinking about it. You have to be diligent. You have to know what your decisions are. Know if there's certain decisions you can't make that otherwise the steps say you could, right? Kind of like, going to shelters here. You obviously can go to a shelter. You should, if you're in a high risk flood zone or, other situations like this, right? But you might feel constrained in that decision. But that step 2 is what you're really, I'm going to say, want to focus on.
It's going to sound silly, but how important should paying attention to climate change and weather be for those of us who are wheelchair users?
Oh, yeah. The weather is a perennial thing, and it's going to impact you in ways that are different than if you're not a wheelchair user. So with flooding, we noticed that so we've done follow-up studies since that first study, and we've expanded beyond hurricanes to local climate risks. And these hazards come in the form of hurricanes, flooding, and heat as well. And especially with flooding that impact wheelchair users much different than non-wheelchair users, because I can take a risk when it comes to a puddle, because if there's like a pothole in that puddle, but if your caster wheel gets stuck in that thing and you're in a power chair and then your wheels are spinning, you can't take that risk, right? Some people will, granted, they'll pop that wheelie and they'll go through the puddle, but what looks like a small puddle to me might be just totally non-permissive to transportation for a wheelchair user. So there's some, real differences there. But then bigger than this, so those are just, weather events, and some of them are chronic and some are phasic, right? Phasic is hurricanes, chronic is like heat and flooding. But beyond that, when it comes to climate change in general and just food security, access to rare earth materials that some of your devices are made from, and how with shifts in power globally and access to multi-continent supply chains like we became accustomed to, we should consider all those things. Sometimes in my field, we're like, all the solutions are high tech. All the solutions are high tech, right? But if it then makes them more fragile in the sense that they're highly complex. So if we're relying on technological complexity, and that's how we're reaching toward this thing called the cure, right? I work for an institution called the Miami Project to Cure Paralysis. And then all of a sudden we remove some of the access to the fundamental materials required to those things because of shifts in power, et cetera, and access, global access, not individual, to materials and whatnot. That's going to make us all more fragile because of the technological complexity. So zooming way out, which we did pretty quick right there, I think we should all be tuned to climate change, and especially those who have, quote unquote, the most to lose because they've been propped up on this complex structure involving super high-tech stuff, right? So keep that in mind when it comes to these topics. Like, you have much more of a vested interest in these kinds of things if you're living in a certain situation that results in certain technological dependency, if you will. Dependency isn't always bad, right? But you have way more vested interest, and it's really interesting because disability and things like sustainability are often not put together. Right? Think about the amount of material waste you generate with all those catheters you were talking about before, and now that they're disposable, they're much better for infection rates. But what are they also worse for? Maybe future generations of ever getting access to things like this, right? So we need to come and put these things in tension. But I think most importantly, like what you're doing here, is we need to just be having that conversation, because most people don't think about climate change and immediately go to spinal cord injury, or the other way around. Think about spinal cord injury, think anything about climate change, right? No, that's a quote unquote problem. That's a wrong framing, but that's a quote unquote problem that needs to be solved now, right? Climate change is, it's different than that, right? People, this is the framing. This is the framing that I think is good, that we're both, breaking in a way. So glad
David,
you asked that.
It's always great having you on here. Go ahead and let the people know. First of all, you gave me like a couple websites. Share the website where they can learn more about the study, or if you guys are opening it up to any more individuals who are participating in it. I already have your Twitter, so I'll share some of that information as well.
Great. Yep. Yeah. So two planes have landed with the studies that were open. We haven't, the next plane hasn't taken off, so we're not currently recruiting, but thank you for that. And Subtropical Climate and Health Hub is the name of the science communication. It's a website, there's social medias, and you can go on there to find all these resources we discussed. The website is especially useful, and it just lists each of the resources. It's very, it's an easy user interface. It's very straightforward. So I would just urge you to go on there. It's essentially an adoption of the packet that the medical students I described previously made. So
again, I appreciate it coming from not only attending the Miami Project, and Jackson, but just as a wheelchair user, that it's not just those of us who have the injuries or the diagnoses that are involved. That there are people like you that are studying and working and putting together these packets and this information, because we need not only the information but the advocacy as well. Because if it's not individuals like us who are speaking out and telling these shelters, hey, we need better supplies, or the transportation, that hey, there are people in these areas, or FPL, help us get our power back at the end of these storms. A lot of us would literally be stuck or floating away, and I really, really don't want that at the end of the season. Again, hurricane season is from June 1st to, is it officially November 30th or 31st? It was, no, 30th. November has 30 days.
Last day. Yep.
Okay. Well, last day.
That's arbitrary, by the way. Like, so, just be attentive during wet season. Be attentive during wet season.
Yes, and we've had a lot of rain these last couple of weeks, and the month just started. The season just started, and they're already talking about it. So don't wait until the last minute. I know the episode's coming out 2 weeks into season, but hopefully everyone's been preparing. I will continue to do so. I will be sharing the resources on the website as I sign up for the services. A lot of them do need to be renewed annually. I did want to mention a bit about getting in touch with your local EMTs or police, letting them know, hey, you live down, like I live pretty close to the Miami Gardens police station. So let them know, hey, I'm a wheelchair user. I might need a little extra assistance if something is going down. They know me very well from my ambulance trips that happen rather often, but tap into your resources. If you are in the Miami or Broward area, you can use the Spinal Cord Injury Support Group. If you guys aren't in the South Florida area, please, if you have local support groups, I know the United Spinal has the Ready to Roll program. I'll be putting all of these in the episode notes. Otherwise, everyone have a wonderful day. Stay out the ring. Dr. David, any last words, any words of encouragement?
Yeah, this is La Nina to El Nino transition year, so things are going to be weird, so don't rely on past patterns. Just stay diligent, and you need help. Yep, let us know.
All right. Looking forward to seeing you the next time I'm down in the area of Jackson or our next virtual meeting. Otherwise, Doc, you have a great one.
Absolutely, too, Rana.
Thanks for tuning in to the show. Connect with the podcast on social media. Check out our Instagram page at ramp.it.up.podcast or email us at rampituppodcast@gmail.com. Until next time.